For this exercise, we're going to work on making a detailed selection and also making a mask. So just as a little review, I'm going to create a layer, and I'm just going to fill it in with a gradient just to have something there. So we've got this rainbow sort of gradient on this layer. And just to recount, if I delete a section of a layer or take the eraser tool, we see the layer below by removing sections. However, while I can use the undo command, it's ultimately not a reversible process. Using this button down here at the bottom of the layer palette that looks like a Japanese or Bangladeshi flag, we can create a layer mask. So the layer mask, if I select it, is just a black and white image. In this case, it's all white. And white means it's there, black means it doesn't show. So using the brush tool, I can erase an area like this. I could also take the polygon lasso tool. And fill that with black, and we have the effect of having erased the layer. Here I can see the mask as it is by holding down the Option or Alt key and clicking on the mask. I can also hold down the Command key and turn the mask into a selection. Another way I can reveal this mask is I can press the backslash key, which will preview it with an orange tint to show the areas that are masked. Now if I have the same brush tool, but simply draw on the mask with a white brush, you can see the image comes back. Now it's important that I don't accidentally draw on the image, because that will just draw black and white on the image, which will be destructive. So in addition to putting masks on layers, as we've seen before, we can also use masking on adjustment layers. And in fact, adjustment layers have masks built into them. There, as you can see, I can bring back the original image there, or flip back to a white brush to bring back the adjustment layer. And even though I made this mask here, which we can see now, with brushes, by holding the Command key and clicking on it, I can still turn it into a selection. You can see those marching ants there. So the goal here for this exercise is that we're going to mask out this plant. Now, there will be a demo plant picture that you can download, but what I'd prefer you do is to photograph your own house plant to use for this exercise. When photographing the plant, make sure that you have plenty of light and that you photograph it at sufficiently high enough shutter speed that the picture is clear and a sufficient aperture that everything is in focus. Selecting out of focus things is possible, but it's an entirely different skill set, which we're not going to address right now. The selecting tools that we're going to look at are the polygon Lasso tool, and more specifically the magnetic lasso tool. So just to start, before we even worry about selecting the plant, let's just go over some basics with the polygon tool. So for starters, if I've started selecting and I've realized I started in the wrong point, the escape key will simply release the selection. Now, just like any select tool, once I've made a selection, I can use the Option key to make an additional selection that subtracts, and I can use the Shift key to make an additional selection that adds. So when selecting something complex like this plant here, you probably won't be able to do it all in one go. You might not even be able to do it in one sitting. So being able to add and subtract from your selections is very useful. So there is a way to save selections. Well, there's multiple ways. There's this option here to save and load selections. I find the interface here to be cumbersome. So when I'm working on a complex selection over time, what I will do is I'll simply make adjustment layers as a way to quickly convert these selections into masks. So because I generally use the curve layer to make adjustments, and I rarely use the levels layer, that's a good option. I also personally never use the brightness and contrast adjustment because I find that curves can create the same effect with more control. So I'll use brightness and contrast layers to save my selection as I go. So you'll notice the moment I click this, we have a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, and it now has a mask that represents my selection. You'll also notice that this layer doesn't do anything. Brightness and contrast, like most adjustment layers, though not all, unless you actually affect an attribute in the properties of the adjustment, it won't have any effect on your image. It's really just kind of like a blank placeholder. So let's say this was my selection. I could now come back to the computer, reopen the file, Photoshop file, and click Command or Control on a Windows computer, and the selection is back, and I can now add another piece to it. So if I was finished working now, what I would probably do is delete this old adjustment layer entirely and simply make a new one that represents where my selection is now. And if I was actually going to save the file, I would call it selection so that I don't confuse it with an actual adjustment layer. So if I was working on selecting different parts of the image, another approach I can use is I can continue to select something over here, for example, and in the same way that I can use the Shift key to add to the selection, I can also press Shift and Command and click on this mask, and now both of these selections are added together. This will be really useful when building a complex selection. Another thing I can even do is I can create a new selection turn that selection into an additional layer, and then I can even put these selections together by doing Command Shift, holding down Command Shift and clicking on the different masks to turn them into selections. I can even do Command Option and subtract. So there you can see the original, and there I've subtracted from the selection. You can see that little notch goes in there. So now we're going to proceed with the more advanced tool, which is the magnetic lasso tool. So you'll notice when selecting the plant with this tool, you simply click, and it really helps to zoom in close. And you can see so far as I've moved along this plant, the tool is doing a very good job of finding the edges. However, here the tool has made a mistake. It's clipped the point on this leaf. That's no problem. I can simply use the delete key and backtrack the cursor as I go by just moving the mouse, and I can go back as many points as I like. So here I'm clicking to add points, and now I'm letting the program drop its own points. Now another important thing is if I want to move through the image from here, the best way to do that is to hold the spacebar key, which gives me this hand tool, which allows me to drag my place in the image. The reason this is the best way to move around the image as you work is, as you can see when I use the hand tool to move around the image, when I let go, the cursor stays right where it was. If I were to, for instance, use the scrolling command, you can see the mouse is just dragging across the image and it's making a total mess of my selection. So I'm deleting points and working my way back down. Now another tip when working on these kinds of selections is if you feel like you're getting tired and you're getting sloppy, just cut across the plant anywhere and make your way back to close your selection. Because as we demonstrated with the simpler select tools, we can keep adding to this selection as we go. Now you might notice on this part of the plant here, there's a gap between the stem and the space behind it. The best way to deal with that sort of thing is to simply ignore it and select around it. Then after that selection is closed, use the Option key, which creates a subtractive selection, and create a point and remove your selection. Now, a sort of finicky thing about this tool is when you create a subtractive selection, you only hold the Option key for the first click, and then just let go of it and proceed like a normal selection. And the same applies to using the Shift key to add to your selection. So it looks like there's a little bit to take away here. And now I'm going to create a layer here and just call it Plant Selection 1. Now this is not part of this bar here is not actually something that we're trying to select, but I'm going to use it as an example of another function of this tool. So if I were selecting along this curved edge and then I found myself working along the straight line, this tool is doing a pretty good job following the straight edge, though it will inevitably make a mistake like it has here and start to curve in or track to some contrast point, you don't actually need to switch to a different tool, because while you're in the process of making a selection with this tool, if you click the Option key and create a point, this now just becomes the ordinary polygon selection tool, which is more ideal for this kind of structure. Now to switch back to the normal magnetic lasso, like where we see this little thing here, what I do is I let go of the Option key, and after I drop a point here, the tool turns back into its magnetic form. I'm just going to cut across here for now. So if you want to work within a selection and you don't want to see it, you can press Command H to hide the selection. Though, as I will demonstrate with this brush tool, the selection is very much still there, even though hidden. Press H to reveal it again, Command H I mean. Now Command D will deselect. So now you can see there's no selection tool there anymore. So looking at just this selection here, something that can be useful for in some situations is I can go to the Select menu and open this option, Select and Mask. This will give me multiple tools with which to tweak my selection. So I can smooth out the edges. I can feather the edges. Changing contrast. It's hard to see probably on YouTube, so I suggest you just try it. I can also shift the edge to make the selection a little smaller or a little larger. There's also an option for edge detection, which is essentially an approach. What that is for is sometimes you can just use the simple polygon tool and then use the edge detection function to kind of turn it into a magnetic lasso after the fact. Personally, I've had mixed results with that. So here in this tool, you have different ways of viewing your selection. You can see it as just marching ants. You can see it as an overlay, on darkness, on white, as if a mask, or on layers. Which in this case shows me nothing because there's nothing behind this layer. So without even turning the selection into a mask, I can right-click on an actual mask and also enter the Select and Mask tool and have all the same functions. So I can shift it, do all those same things. These smart refine edge tools are helpful, but for really complicated objects like this plant, you kind of just have to select everything really carefully. So here I'm using Shift to create an additive selection. Just keep going. Something I really recommend against is, I would say, don't try to select a large thing all in one go, because I promise you'll end up making one faulty click. You'll be selecting along complex edges, and then you'll accidentally double click, and it will just cut straight across and totally spoil your work. So work slowly, save your progress as you go by creating these adjustment layers as placeholders for your selection. Right now what I'm doing is just deleting all the redundant ones, and I'll rename this selection. Just take your time as you go. So ultimately, the goal will be to select the whole thing out like this. So once you've selected the entire plant, in this case I've chosen to keep the pot. I have not kept these wires on top. Really, the plant is the main thing you have to get. It's your judgment whether to include the pot or not. So once you've selected the whole plant, what I'd like you to do is to unlock the background layer. You could have done that in the beginning actually, and apply a mask to that layer. So now your image will just be this checkerboard pattern in the background. I'd then like you to create a new layer, which will go behind, which you'll drag down to the bottom so it's behind the plant, and use the gradient tool to just put an obviously artificial background behind the image. So in this case, I'm going to take the gradient tool and I'm going to pick sort of pink violet. And gray. I'll drag the line up this way. Oh, maybe that was the opposite. Down this way, there we go. And obviously this is not to create, the ideal aesthetic effect. It's just to show how effective your selection was. So after you've made that selection, you can save the Photoshop document so that you can come back and scrutinize those masks in the future. But for turning the exercise in, I'd like you to go to Save As and save this image as a JPEG for easier upload, which you can then actually save into your export folder. So once you've saved the JPEG, it'll give you this option of compression. You can compress it a little bit, maybe down to 10. Progressive or optimized is fine. So save that JPEG file and then upload that to the corresponding exercise in the box, and you are done. I will say, just as a word of emotional advice for embarking on a complex selection like this, that it will be a little frustrating probably for the first quarter of the time you work on it, but I hope that all of you will achieve a state of selecting zen, as I like to think of it, where you can really just get into it and select away. If you have any good podcasts or anything to listen to, that definitely helps.